Welcome back to Goku-Sun DVC and welcome back for a special new countdown list. In this video, I am looking at 20 of my personal favorite 16-bit video game soundtracks of all time. So hopefully you enjoy the list, and if you haven't heard some of these soundtracks, I highly recommend looking them up and check it out. One good YouTube channel to check out if you want classic video game music, check out Axel Stone. He has a great list of video game soundtracks and many 16-bit ones. So with that said, first up, coming at number 20, this game was released on the Sega Genesis. And that is a classic. It technically hasn't aged super well, but I do have a fondness for the soundtrack. Coming at number 20 for me personally is Eternal Champions for the Sega Genesis. Underrated soundtrack, hasn't aged as great as some other 16-bit fine soundtracks, but I still like it for what it is. Call it blind nostalgia. Coming in at number 19, released for the Super Nintendo, the original classic 16-bit Killer Instinct soundtrack comes in at number 19. Coming in at number 18 is another all-time classic released for the Super Nintendo. Coming in at number 18 is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time. Next, coming in at number 17, released for the Super Nintendo originally, though it would get re-released and the incorrect number mistake would be fixed. But coming in at number 17 is Final Fantasy, at the time 2, also Final Fantasy 4. Seriously, if you haven't heard, this is a true all-time classic Final Fantasy soundtrack. I highly recommend. Coming in next at number 16 is another classic Super Nintendo soundtrack that is great. Really, it would be one of the first games to really create the subgenre today that is known as Metroidvanias. Coming in at number 16 is Super Metroid. Arguably, in many people's opinions, the greatest Metroid game of all time. If you're talking the classic side-scrolling version style Metroid, I would say probably Super Metroid is probably the best, though I actually also hold up there Metroid Fusion. Though I'm still rather partial to the GameCube Metroid Prime. But with that said, anyways, 16-bit soundtrack-wise, coming in at number 15, another all-time classic from the Super Nintendo and Capcom, one of my favorite franchises of all time, and that is coming at number 15 of my favorite 16-bit soundtracks, Mega Man 7, or Rockman 7 in Japan. But yeah, Mega Man 7 does have a superb soundtrack, probably one of the best soundtracks of the original Mega Man series as a whole. Coming in next at number 14, released for the Super Nintendo, and that is the original classic from Rareware at the time, and of course that is the original classic Donkey Kong Country. Though Diddy's Kong Quest is my personal probably favorite game of the series, I think it's aged the best. Soundtrack is great, but I still have a much harder nostalgia for the original game soundtrack. Coming in at number coming at number 13, released for the Super Nintendo, Super Star Wars, or of course, side-scrolling game based on obviously Episode 4: A New Hope. One of the hardest, I think, classic, really side-scrolling platformers I've ever played on the Super Nintendo by far, I think is probably in the top 5 hardest platformers I've played on the SNES. But I definitely have fondness. I'm surprised at how good the 16-bit Star Wars soundtrack actually is. So, with that said, next coming in at number 11, or coming in at number 12, is going now back to the Sega Genesis. At number 12 is Sonic 2. Superb soundtrack. I still think at least Sonic 1 soundtrack has stayed a little closer to me personally for nostalgia factor, though Sonic 2 is arguably the best of the classic games as a whole. But still, the soundtrack is amazing nevertheless. Coming in at number 11, you hear playing right now in the background my 11th favorite 16-bit soundtrack, going again to the Sega Genesis. Coming in at number 11 is Echo the Dolphin. Yeah, that's what you hear in the background. It's from Echo the Dolphin. Superb soundtrack. Love it. And I have a real fondness for Echo the Dolphin, I'll be honest. I have a weird fondness for that platformer series for some bizarre reason. Coming at number 10, going back to the SNES of soundtracks, and that is the classic The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past. Arguably, probably the best earlier Zelda soundtrack, pure and simple. At least up until the GameCube, in my opinion. Don't get me wrong, I love Ocarina of Time, and I like the weird bizarreness that is Majora's Mask soundtrack, but there's just something special about A Link to the Past. I think the music and the game in general are all legendary status, in my opinion. Coming in at number 9, one of the most underrated, I think, video game soundtracks of the 16-bit era. Again, on the Sega Genesis, and a superb game, pretty hard, classic beat 'em up style game, but I love the art style, the music, and everything about it. For me, coming in at number 9 is Comix Zone. If you've never played Comix Zone, do yourself a service and check the game out. It's a lot of fun. You can play in a lot of the Sega Genesis collections. Just be warned, it is a very high difficulty beat 'em up. It is way harder than like Streets of Rage or Final Fight, in my opinion. But that's kind of one of the things that appeals to me about the game. That, and I love the overall pacing and the way the game was made like a living, breathing comic book is just awesome. And I have not seen this duplicated throughout all the years, weirdly enough. I would say one of the closest things to probably influence Tally was probably stuff like River City Girls. It's probably one of the most modern things. I'd say it was influenced by it. Coming at number 8 is the original classic Sonic the Hedgehog soundtrack, which is still arguably one of, I think, the best platformer soundtracks of all time, not just for 16-bit or for Sonic. If you've never listened in whole beginning to end the original Sonic the Hedgehog soundtrack, do yourself a pleasure and enjoy and listen to it. The music, it speaks for itself, in my opinion. Coming in at number 7 is one of arguably my personal favorite of the Mario series. Not necessarily my favorite Mario soundtrack of all time, but definitely in 16-bit era is arguably one of the best and probably one of the most heavily nostalgia for me personally. And that being coming at number 7, Super Mario World comes in at number 7 for me. Coming in at number 6, go back to the Genesis, and that is one of the greatest 16-bit JRPGs of all time, and that is Phantasy Star 4. If you haven't, seriously, check out the Phantasy Star series in general. Play the games, especially, I highly recommend checking out 2 and 4, but even though a lot of people bash it, I'd say check out Phantasy Star 3. I think it gets a little too much hate, in my personal opinion. Though, in my opinion, viewpoint, Final Fantasy, or Phantasy Star 4, is the Final Fantasy 6 of the Phantasy Star series. Coming in at number 5 is one of the most criminally underrated fine game soundtracks of all time, in my opinion, of this era, and that is Mortal Kombat 3. It is an amazing soundtrack. Even Vanilla 3 soundtrack is still upper levels, in my opinion. Most of the modern Mortal Kombat games, though they are great gameplay-wise, the music has kind of sucked for the most part, in my opinion. The last Mortal Kombat game I think I genuinely enjoyed the overall soundtrack of was probably Mortal Kombat Deception. And that was back, we're talking like 15 years ago, at least. Which is kind of crazy to think it's been that long since we've had a really great overall solid. But MK3 soundtrack deserves way more love than it gets, in my opinion. Coming in at number 4, one of the greatest RPGs of all time, and one of the greatest RPG soundtracks, and one of the greatest 16-bit soundtracks ever done by Square. And that coming in at number 4 is Chrono Trigger, which really needs no introduction by now, as it is better than, well, in my opinion, it's easily in probably the top 5 best Square RPGs of all time, and I don't think that's a hot take at all. And seriously, check it out. Play the game and just enjoy the music. Coming at number 3 is probably the most iconic fighting game soundtrack of the 16-bit era, in my opinion. That being Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Specifically the SNES version. I think, though, since it's called Champion on Genesis, I think, though, the Super Nintendo, maybe audio is just a little bit better overall. But take that with a grain of salt. Coming in at number 2 for the Super Nintendo, originally known as Final Fantasy III, but the correct is, of course, Final Fantasy VI, and is probably the single best 16-bit RPG soundtrack of all time, and as well as in probably top 3 best RPG soundtracks ever done by Square Enix. Coming in at number 1 needs no introduction for me personally, as it is my favorite SNES game of all time. It's pretty much my number 1 favorite 2D side-scrolling platformer of all time. It is my favorite game of the series, and is in my top 3 favorite Capcom games of all time. And that is Mega Man X, the original. The soundtrack to Mega Man X, it is simply something you must experience for yourself. Every single piece of music is just, in my opinion, basically super epic tier. If I was to do a tier list, it definitely belongs on that list for me personally. It is easily, I think, one of the greatest soundtracks of any video game of the entire 90s. But with that said, leave a comment, tell me what are some of your personal favorite RPG soundtracks of all time. Overall, I would say I like Genesis soundtracks about equally as much as Super Nintendo, even some of the quality is a little better on the SNES, but there are many great soundtracks even I didn't even mention off the Genesis that has superb soundtracks. I mean, heck, you have many others, but with that said, I'll see y'all next time. Same YouTube time, same YouTube channel, and stay safe out there, and happy holidays. See you soon.